The ship wasn't supposed to be there. That single fact, simple, almost mundane, is the thread that unravels everything. Not a catastrophic mechanical failure. Not a rogue wave or a sudden storm rolling in off the Tyrrhenian Sea. Just a decision. One man's decision, made quietly on a bridge, lit by instrument panels and the soft glow of navigational screens, to take a ship the size of a small city and steer it somewhere it had no business being. It is the evening of Friday, January 13th, 2012. On board the Costa Concordia, 4,229 people are in the middle of exactly the kind of night a Mediterranean cruise promises. The restaurants are full. The casino is alive with noise and light. Somewhere in the ship's theater, a show has just begun. Children are asleep in their cabins. Couples are walking the open decks, looking out at a calm, dark sea. The air is mild. The stars are out. Everything is exactly as it should be. And then the world tilts. The Costa Concordia was, by almost any measure, a marvel. When she entered service in 2006, she was the largest cruise ship ever built in Italy, nearly 290 meters long, displacing over 114,000 tons. She carried restaurants, bars, multiple swimming pools, a casino, a Formula One simulator, and enough crew to staff a small hotel. Her name was chosen deliberately. Concordia. Harmony. The word itself was a promise. That 15 decks of steel and glass could carry thousands of strangers through some of the world's most beautiful waters without incident, without drama, without fear. For 6 years, the ship kept that promise. She sailed the Mediterranean in a slow, graceful rotation. Rome to Savona, Barcelona to Palma, the Greek islands, and back again. Passengers came aboard in suits and sundresses and left with photographs and memories. The ship earned a reputation as one of the smoothest, most stable vessels on the circuit. To sail on the Concordia was considered, by those who could afford it, something close to effortless luxury. The man in command of her that January night was Captain Francesco Schettino, 52 years old, Neapolitan, a career sailor who had spent decades working his way up through the ranks of Costa Cruises, the parent company, a subsidiary of the Carnival Corporation, one of the largest cruise operators on Earth. Inside the company, Schettino was known as confident, even charismatic. He had commanded the Concordia for several years by this point and knew her intimately, or believed he did. What Schettino had planned for that Friday evening was not a secret, at least not entirely. There is a tradition in Italian maritime culture, informal, entirely unofficial, known as an incino. The word means, roughly, a bow, a salute. The practice involves steering a large vessel close to shore, close enough that passengers on deck can see the coastline in vivid detail, and close enough that residents ashore can watch the ship pass like a floating city. The horn sounds. People wave. It is theatrical, undeniably spectacular, and profoundly dangerous when performed by a ship that displaces over 100,000 tons. The island of Giglio sits off the Tuscan coast, a small, rocky outcrop of roughly 900 permanent residents, fishermen, innkeepers, and families whose roots in that particular patch of the Tyrrhenian Sea go back generations. Its waters are beautiful and treacherous in equal measure. Submerged rock formations extend outward from the island's edges, forcing large vessels to give it a wide berth. Standard procedure for a ship the size of the Concordia was to pass several kilometers from the shore. That night, Schettino intended to pass within a few hundred meters of it. The connection was personal. A former colleague of Schettino's, a retired captain named Mario Palombo, lived on Giglio. Schettino had reportedly called ahead, telling Palombo to watch for the ship. He would bring her in close, sound the horn, give the island a proper greeting. What he did not know was that Palombo was not even on the island that night. The incino was, in one terrible sense, a gesture made for an audience that wasn't there. At 9:34 in the evening, the Concordia is still moving at speed, roughly 16 knots, as she approaches the island. The water here is not charted for vessels of this size. The rocks below the surface are clearly marked on every official maritime navigation chart in circulation. They are not hidden. They are not ambiguous. They are there, in print, on paper, because sailors have known about them for centuries. On the bridge, there is a moment of confusion. Schettino gives an order to turn. A crew member, a sailor from Indonesia, working in a language that was not his own, interprets the command incorrectly. The resulting arc of the ship's turn carries her roughly 650 meters closer to the island than Schettino had intended. He realizes the error and immediately orders a correction, a hard turn in the opposite direction. It is already too late. At 9:45 in the evening, the Costa Concordia strikes a submerged rock formation known as Lascaux. The impact tears a 50-meter gash along the port side of the hull, cutting through 5 separate compartments, including the section housing the ship's electrical generators. Water begins to flood the lower decks with immediate, brutal efficiency. Within minutes, it reaches the engine room. The generators fail. The engines go dark. At 9:52, the Concordia loses all power. Above, in the dining rooms, in the casino, and the theater, the first sign is a shudder. A deep, metallic groan that passengers feel more than hear. Plates slide. Glasses tip. The music stops. The lights flicker, die, and then, after a few long seconds that must have felt like much longer, the emergency lighting kicks in, casting everything in a pale, uncertain glow. The announcement comes over the intercom almost immediately. It is, in retrospect, extraordinary in its calm. There has been a technical issue with the ship's electrical system, passengers are told. The crew is working to resolve it. There is no cause for alarm. For a few minutes, many people believe this. The Concordia is vast enough that the initial listing is barely perceptible. A slight, almost dreamlike tilt, the kind you might attribute to wave movement if the sea weren't perfectly calm. But the floor keeps tilting. The water in glasses slants to one side. Doors that closed easily now stick. Elevators stop working. And the crew, those who aren't actively managing the crisis below decks, begin to look at each other in ways that passengers notice. By 10 o'clock, the ship is listing at over 10 degrees. Furniture begins to slide. Walking the corridors requires holding the handrail. Passengers start pulling on their life jackets without being told to. Some take out their phones and call the Italian Coast Guard directly, describing what they are seeing, because the voice on the intercom is still telling them everything is fine. At 10:36, the Maritime Rescue Coordination Center in Livorno makes radio contact with the Concordia. The ship's officers continue to maintain that the situation is a technical malfunction. The Coast Guard, now receiving contradictory accounts from passengers' phone calls, is not convinced. Meanwhile, on the bridge, Francesco Schettino is trying to save his ship, or at least what remains of her. With the Concordia powerless in listing, he uses the emergency steering mechanism to try to bring her alongside the island, reasoning that grounding her near Giglio's harbor will simplify the rescue operation if evacuation becomes necessary. It is not an entirely irrational decision, but it is a decision made by a man who has still not ordered his passengers to abandon ship. 45 minutes have passed since the collision. Some crew members, seeing the angle of the deck, feeling the list increasing under their feet, understanding what the instruments are telling them, begin to act independently. They start pulling passengers out of cabins, directing them toward the muster stations, handing out life jackets without waiting for authorization. It is an act of conscience that almost certainly saves lives. At 10:33, the general emergency alarm finally sounds. But by then, the ship has a list exceeding 30 degrees in places. On the port side, which has risen out of the water, the lifeboats are inaccessible, their davits angled uselessly against the sky. On the starboard side, which is closer to the water's surface, some boats can still be deployed, but the chaos of thousands of people suddenly flooding the open decks in the dark makes organized evacuation almost impossible. People are screaming. People are searching for children, for partners, for anyone they recognize. Instructions are being given in Italian, then English, then fragments of other languages. And in the noise and the darkness and the tilting geometry of the ship, many of them are not reaching the people who need to hear them. Some passengers make a decision that speaks to the extremity of the moment. They climb to the high side of the ship and jump. The water is cold, January cold, and the drop from the deck is significant. But the island is less than 150 meters away, and some of them prefer to swim for it rather than wait. At 10:44, the Concordia strikes the seafloor near a point called Punta Gabbianara, coming to rest on her side in shallow water close to Giglio's harbor. The impact is violent enough to knock people off their feet, but it also, paradoxically, prevents the ship from sinking entirely. She holds there, tilted, half submerged, enormous, broken. as the rescue operation escalates around her. Within the hour, more than 25 vessels are in the water around the wreck. Coast Guard patrol boats, Guardia de Finanza cutters, Carabinieri launches, and civilian fishing boats from Giglio and the mainland, their owners having heard what was happening and simply gone out to help. Helicopters from the airbase at Grosseto sweep their searchlights across the dark water, picking out figures in the waves. On the island itself, in a community that in January numbers fewer than 1,000 people, every door is opening. The town hall becomes a shelter. Gymnasia, churches, private homes, all of them filling through the night with shivering survivors wrapped in blankets borrowed from strangers. By morning, the population of Giglio will have swelled to nearly 5 times its winter size. It is, amid the catastrophe, something genuinely remarkable. A small island absorbing 4,000 shipwrecked strangers and asking nothing in return. But while survivors are still making their way ashore, something else is happening that will define this disaster as much as the collision itself. At 11:20 that evening, Francesco Schettino is no longer on his ship. The precise circumstances of his departure are disputed. Schettino would later say he lost his footing and fell accidentally into a lifeboat as it was being lowered. He would say he continued to coordinate the rescue operation from the water. He would say that being close to the ship, in a boat, gave him a better vantage point from which to direct proceedings. What is not disputed is that at 12:42 in the morning, while hundreds of passengers are still on board, some trapped in flooded corridors and dark cabins they cannot escape. The commander of the Italian Coast Guard's Livorno sector reaches Schettino by radio and discovers that the captain of the Costa Concordia is sitting in a lifeboat. What follows is one of the most extraordinary radio exchanges in modern maritime history. Captain Gregorio De Falco of the Coast Guard does not raise his voice. Not exactly, but the iron in his words is absolute. He orders Schettino back onto the ship. Schettino equivocates. De Falco orders him again. And then, with a precision that becomes instantly famous, De Falco delivers the phrase that will follow Schettino for the rest of his life. Vada a bordo. Caso. Get back on board. Schettino does not go back on board. The phrase, in its blunt urgency, captures something that the entire watching world will recognize. The image of a commander who has abandoned not just his ship, but the most fundamental obligation of his position, while the man on the radio represents everything seamanship is supposed to mean. In the days after the disaster, 32 people are confirmed dead. Many of them are found in the lower decks of the ship, in the flooded corridors and cabins where they became trapped when the angle of the hull made escape impossible. Some are found months later, when divers eventually penetrate the deepest sections of the wreck. The last victim is not recovered until November of 2014, nearly 3 years after the ship went down. The investigation begins immediately, and what it reveals strips away every possible technical explanation. The rocks were on the charts. The route deviation was unauthorized. The Incino was a personal whim performed in the dark at speed in shallow water. The delay in ordering evacuation, nearly 50 minutes, cost lives that might have been saved. The cover story about a generator malfunction, maintained in radio communications even as the ship was clearly going under, robbed passengers of precious minutes they needed to reach the decks. Costa Cruises, the parent company, moves quickly to establish distance. The deviation from the authorized route was Schettino's decision alone, they say. He acted without company authorization. He violated protocol at every critical juncture. The company offers compensation to survivors, approximately 14,000 euros per person, while simultaneously facing hundreds of civil lawsuits from victims' families. Schettino was arrested on January 17th, 4 days after the disaster. The charges are serious and multiple manslaughter, causing a shipwreck and abandoning ship before the completion of evacuation. The trial begins in the summer of 2013 and runs for nearly 2 years. Throughout the proceedings, Schettino maintains versions of his earlier claims. The rocks were not properly indicated on his navigational charts. The accident was not fully foreseeable. His decision to bring the ship close to Giglio actually helped save lives, because grounding her near the harbor meant passengers were within swimming distance of shore. He did not abandon ship voluntarily. He coordinated the rescue from outside. Very few people are persuaded. On February 11th, 2015, Francesco Schettino is convicted on all charges and sentenced to 16 years in prison. 5 other senior officers received shorter sentences. It is one of the most significant maritime criminal convictions in European legal history. In Italy, the verdict is received with something between grim satisfaction and unresolved grief. 32 people died on a calm winter night, on a modern ship, inside of a populated coast, during an era when maritime safety technology is more sophisticated than at any point in human history. The outcome was not inevitable. It was chosen. The phrase that emerges from the disaster, fare uno scatino, to do a scatino, enters Italian vernacular almost immediately. It means to abandon your post when it matters most, to vanish at the moment of crisis. It is not a compliment. The physical wreck of the Concordia presents its own enormous challenge. She rests within the Pelagos Sanctuary, a protected marine area designated for the preservation of Mediterranean cetaceans. Her fuel tanks still hold approximately 2,300 tons of heavy oil. If that oil reaches the water, the ecological damage to one of the most carefully protected marine ecosystems in Europe would be catastrophic. The fuel extraction alone takes 32 days, a delicate operation of heating the semi-solidified oil and pumping it into a tanker vessel anchored alongside. But that is only the beginning. The decision is made not to dismantle the ship in place, an operation that would contaminate the seabed and take years, but to refloat her. It is an engineering undertaking without precedent at that scale. Nearly 500 engineers, divers, and technicians spend more than a year preparing the operation. They build a steel platform on the seafloor beneath the hull. They attach enormous air-filled metal chambers, called sponsons, to the sides of the ship. They run steel cables to hydraulic systems anchored in the rock. On September 16, 2013, more than 20 months after the disaster, the operation begins. Slowly, over 19 hours, the Concordia is rotated upright. It is called parbuckling, and it has never been attempted on a vessel of this mass. When the ship finally stands vertical in the early hours of September 17th, the engineers watching from the support vessels understand they have done something genuinely unprecedented. The following summer, on July 23, 2014, tugboats begin pulling the Concordia away from Giglio for the last time. She makes the journey under tow to the port of Genoa, a slow, strange procession, the ghost of a ship trailing through waters she once sailed in glory. In Genoa, the work of dismantling her begins. By 2017, the Costa Concordia no longer exists. The total cost of the disaster, the salvage, the legal proceedings, and the compensation paid out reaches nearly $2 billion. The legacy of the disaster extends well beyond its finances. In the months following the wreck, the International Maritime Organization, the United Nations body that regulates global shipping, revises its safety protocols. Before the Concordia, cruise lines were permitted to conduct passenger safety drills within the first 24 hours of a voyage. Many ships ran these drills after departure, meaning passengers spent their first night on board without having been shown where to go in an emergency. After the Concordia, the rule changes. Musters must happen before the ship leaves port. The informal practice of the Incino, already frowned upon by maritime authorities, is formally prohibited. Companies institute new navigation rules requiring that any deviation from an approved route must be justified and logged. The use of English as the mandatory language for critical bridge commands becomes standard on multinational vessels, addressing the communication failure that contributed to the final moments before impact. Crew emergency training is intensified. And perhaps most significantly, the culture of deference to the captain. The near-absolute authority that had been a feature of maritime tradition for centuries begins to give way to a model borrowed from commercial aviation, where any officer has not just the right, but the obligation to challenge a command that appears unsafe. The comparison to the Titanic is, by now, well established. And not only because both disasters occurred exactly a century apart, in 1912 and 2012. Both ships struck submerged obstacles on calm, clear nights. Both were among the largest and most celebrated vessels of their era. Both disasters were shaped more by human decision-making than by the indifference of the sea. But the differences matter too. The Titanic sank hundreds of miles from land, in waters where rescue was almost impossible to reach in time. The Concordia went down within sight of a shore less than 150 meters away, and still 32 people died. The Titanic's captain, Edward Smith, went down with his ship. The Concordia's captain sat in a lifeboat while passengers were still trapped inside. What lingers, long after the legal verdicts and the engineering achievements and the revised maritime regulations, is a question that does not fully resolve. How does a ship like the Concordia sink? Not mechanically, not technically. The question is deeper than that. It sinks because the culture around a single individual, his authority, his vanity, his desire to perform a gesture for an audience that wasn't even watching, is allowed to go unchallenged long enough to matter. It sinks because an announcement over an intercom can substitute for the truth for 45 critical minutes while people go back to their cabins, believing they are safe. It sinks because the gap between what a system promises and what a system delivers can be measured, sometimes, in 32 lives. The Concordia was not an old ship. She was not a dangerous ship. She was, by every specification, one of the safest, most modern passenger vessels on Earth. And none of that was enough. Because safety is not only about what a ship is built to withstand, it is about the decisions made by the people standing at the helm when the moment arrives. The island of Giglio has returned to its quiet winter rhythms. The rock formation called Lascaux still rises from the seafloor of the Tyrrhenian Sea, marked clearly on every chart. The harbor where thousands of survivors came ashore in the cold hours of a January morning is still there, still busy in the summer months with tourists who come for the clear water and the unhurried pace of island life. Most of them have no idea what happened here. And maybe that is the most unsettling part of all. Not the disaster itself, but how completely a place can absorb what happened to it and go on and become beautiful again, while the question of why it happened remains, in its deepest form, unanswered. If this story stayed with you, and I hope it did, then you're exactly the kind of person this channel exists for. At Behind the Enigma, we dig into the cases, the disasters, and the mysteries that refuse to be filed away and forgotten. If you haven't subscribed yet, now is the moment. Hit that button, turn on notifications, and join a community that believes the most important stories are always the ones that make us look harder at the world we think we understand. Thank you for watching. We'll see you in the next one.